and we are off topic. Coming at you from the middle of the night to demonstrate the idea behind the subject of this episode, which is that everything has a middle. This night has one. I'm sitting in it right now. The Boston cream donut I finished a few minutes ago had a delicious creamy middle. Your life has a middle. Had a beginning.
And if you're celebrating the beginning of yours today, happy birthday.
But you don't know where the middle is because you don't know when it's going to end. The middle of your life could have been half a lifetime ago because we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, do we? Or it could be way out in front of you. Sometimes you don't know where the middle is. Sometimes the middle can be good. Sometimes the middle can be bad. There's things that have a left, a middle, and a right, or an outside and an inside that might be considered the middle. The real point of this episode, though, is going to be to teach us to look toward the middle, or at least that we can look toward the middle from wherever we are relative to it. Doesn't even mean we have to move in that direction. Just to turn that direction and see it. Stepping in that direction might prove beneficial once we've turned that way. It might not. That's the subject that we're going to explore. We're going to do it with all kinds of different things. The subject that brought this idea to my mind isn't one that you're even going to think of. It's the topic of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Try to imagine where the middle of that is, and then see if you're right or wrong when we come to that part of this episode here in a little while that was actually filmed earlier today. I'm also going to talk a little bit about why a second podcast. What am I doing here with Off Topic relative to and next to my first podcast, Odd Man In? I have a pretty cool metaphor that I think is really spot on with respect to how to describe my approach to these two things next to each other. We're going to get into that as well, and it has to do with puppies. So we got PTSD, we got puppies, we got all kinds of other things with middles that we're going to talk about. Most of it recorded earlier today. Some of it's going to be recorded tomorrow. But between now and then, I'm sleepy and I'm going to go to bed. So in a few moments, I will be coming to you from yesterday, and then we'll see where it goes from there. Looking forward to it, people. Welcome to Off Topic, and here we go. Yep. So good. Back to the puppy. Off Topic is my second podcast. And the metaphor is this. You get a new puppy.
Yeah! That's what's called an attention getter. Folks, there comes a time in every podcast when the producer must decide between what we'll call perfection and what I call authenticity. Well, I'm an authentic guy every time, and so in the spirit of that nature, I'm going to let you in on what happened next.
A new puppy is the most diabolically paradoxical thing in almost Milo, stop.
Holy shit! I think we may have just discovered the transition sound effect for the Off Topic podcast. Folks, I know it looks like I'm praying in this freeze frame, but remember, it's just a freeze frame. What actually happened, though, was quite miraculous. He stopped, and the unrehearsed response is just priceless.
A new puppy is one of the most diabolically paradoxical things you can imagine. The Christmas morning is the cute, cuddly, amazingly joyous moment. And almost every moment thereafter is ridiculously challenging in some way, shape, or form. This little thing has no vector. It has no discipline. Everything about it is impulsive, and it can suck you absolutely dry. And at some point, a month or two into the ownership, you walk into your living room and it's been transformed into a real world-sized snow globe full of couch cushion fluff. And you just are about ready to grab that puppy and just like, why? But you can't, right?
Of course you can't. You can't even kick a puppy out, much less strangle it. God, these donuts are good. But seriously, a puppy-human relationship is the most inescapable relationship a human being can have on this planet. It is way easier to get rid of a human than to get rid of a puppy. You can get divorced 3 times and people be like, oh man, rough luck, dude. You abuse 3 dogs, abandon 3 dogs, you do anything to 3 dogs other than put up with them and figure it out, you'd be labeled some kind of freaking psychopath.
So you find yourself stuck. And then some idiot friend of yours says to you, you know what you got to do? You got to get a second puppy. Blows your mind, but then you start to realize
that this option doesn't even require that you move to Utah. I'm kidding. You do you, polygamists, and more power to you. Most of us guys would say we've got our hands full with, just the one puppy. I'm kidding. I love my puppy very much. So much, in fact, that I wouldn't mind having a few more. I mean, wouldn't want to have more than just the one. Fuck. Donut. Where's a donut?
there's some wisdom in that, because the original puppy no longer needs every single thing that it gets from the world from its humans. The two young dogs, animals, interact in a way that takes the energy out of them. And brings them to a place of exhaustive compliance and discipline that you never even knew was imaginable. So the concept of the second puppy is just that you're not doubling your work with that second puppy. You're actually cutting it in half. Off Topic is my second puppy. Off Topic is a place for all of the energy to go that doesn't belong in my first podcast, Odd Man In. Odd Man In is a niche podcast. It's kind of my baby. It's my golden retriever, if you will. Off Topic is the mutt I'm grabbing from the Humane Society to put everything else that doesn't belong there.
It's at this point that I said something kind of stupid and pointless that if you lip readers watching the video version of this want to take a crack at, have a nut. But the point is that Off Topic is the second puppy, and both podcasts are going to be better because they have each other.
It's going to be fun. Look forward to seeing what happens. We are Off Topic, and the subject is everything has a middle.
The middle sounds boring, you guys. And this might be an episode that you might think, oh, screw this. You might have already clicked past it, and fuck you if you did. but if you're here, and I may take this little bit and stick it up in the front. If you're here after the fucking puppy explanation of why this podcast even exists in the first place, and you're hearing this now, stick with me. I am going to put this in the front because this is not a subject that a lot of us want to think about. We don't want to think about turning to the middle. We don't want to think about compromise. We want to be right, and we want to be heard. We want to be loud, but that's natural. But if you will stick with me, I will help explain why there's so much validation in a different approach. Okay, that's where we're going to go. Let's talk about the fact that I can't think of anything that doesn't have a middle in some way, shape, or form. Okay?
This is where all the jackass listeners try desperately to think of something that doesn't have a middle. Don't be that guy. What about like a Mobius strip, man? No. Think about common ground, people. Don't think about differences. Come together, come along for the ride. You'll learn more in life if you do it that way than always trying to prove people wrong. Here we go. Let's do it.
The PTSD thing, if PTSD has a middle, everything can have a middle. Okay? So let's talk about time. I talked to you at the intro of this episode about the middle of the night. Well, there's the middle of the day too, and there's things that are deemed appropriate for either one of those. Middle of the night, you ought to be asleep or drunk. Middle of the day, you ought to be at work or doing something.
Like drinking.
You can be judged by your participation in the middle of wherever you are and whether or not you're doing what people think you should do. What about an activity like a football game? Halftime is the middle. That's when people stop, evaluate what's going on, assess whether things are going right or wrong, what changes need to be made. That can be applied to all kinds of things, job situations, personal relationships, all kinds of stuff like that. We talked about the middle of your life already in the intro. We don't even know when that is, but it's best to treat it as though it could be at any point. How about the middle of a struggle? How about the middle of some shit that's going on that's hard, and you're in the middle of a really, really shitty time in your life? Well, guess what? A lot of times when people look back on their lives, they look at those periods of time as the times when they learned the biggest lessons. They learned the most about themselves. They grew more in those times. If you can say, look, I'm in the middle of something right now, but that something isn't everything. What can I do here to A, move myself in the direction of out, and B, understand that I'm not completely lost? How about this, guys? How about the middle as a stopping point? Like you're on a journey and you get partway there, sometimes that might be a rest. Sometimes it might be the end of the line. There's a thing about the city of Denver that it wouldn't exist if there hadn't have been quitters headed west to discover the new world. Everybody going to California, and one group gets to the Rocky Mountains and says, nope. This looks like as good a spot as any, folks. PTSD had a journey from a point of non-existence to a point of what I'm going to contend is overuse. And there's a point in the middle where I think would have been a perfect stopping point. The city of Denver is a lovely city. And if those folks with that semi-half-hearted attitude wouldn't have stopped and built a city of Denver, who knows where marijuana would have first been legalized. Here we go with PTSD. Going to start with a story and talk about an evolution, and then maybe consider a stopping point that would have been closer to the middle than to the other extreme of overuse that we have sort of evolved into in this particular situation, and in many situations like it since then. I was listening to a podcaster, okay, and he was talking about his daughter post-COVID and the difficulties she had with the time that she spent isolated, and how coming back from that was so challenging and really scary for her. And that's God, what a thing as a parent, to see that, to realize that your kid is going through something so hard that maybe wasn't even necessary. Who knows? Time will tell. But he referred to her condition as PTSD. So by definition, what that does is it associates her experience with trauma. Now, trauma is a word that has had a definition for a really long time.
For you audio-only listeners, the definition we've put on the screen from the American Psychological Association reads, trauma is an emotional response to a terrible event like an accident, crime, or natural disaster.
And it is pretty severe. It's pretty significant. And PTSD is something that is pretty severe and pretty significant, the definition of which came from wartime soldiers who would come back having seen horrific, horrific things, faces blown off, in front of them. Maybe behind their trigger, or behind their trigger. They're behind the trigger, in front of their trigger. Things that you could really talk about, the horrific realities of war. And this is something I'll digress on in a moment to talk about why it's a great thing that started to become, defined and known and understood for the sake of our soldiers. But for now, what I want to talk about is this trauma idea. What this podcaster's daughter went through is real. It's significant. It needs to be recognized and understood so that it can be treated and dealt with appropriately, whether that be by the parents or by a professional or whatever might be required. But is it trauma, and why does it matter if it is or if it isn't? Let me tell you why. Because when a word has a definition and a subsequent term, so trauma has a definition, a subsequent term, post-traumatic stress disorder has a definition. If we broaden that too much, then we're not doing a service to either extreme. This idea can be applied to a whole lot of things, by the way. We'll get into some of that probably in future episodes, but for right now, let's understand that trauma needs to be what trauma has always been, and what's happening on the other side of the middle, if you will, needs to have a name, but probably not the same name, because you don't treat those two things the same, so why would you start with the same definition and figure it out from there? Let's talk about the goodness of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. So right between the T and the S, right in the middle. All right. War at one point in our history was just a horrific thing that men were understood to go face, deal with, and figure out. And guys would come back from war with horrific mental, emotional scars that the world wasn't acknowledging was terribly important, and they weren't getting any help dealing with the struggle associated with that stuff that they were coming back with. The example that I'm going to bring up is fictional, but they did a really good job of portraying it. You guys may have heard of a show on Netflix called Peaky Blinders. All right, weird, fucked up name, not particularly interesting. I still don't know what it means. My wife and I are in season 6. Okay, there's only 6 seasons, and then a movie, I guess, that they're making now, which is going to be cool.
Earthlings, as you get to know me a little better, you'll learn one thing for certain, and that is that I hate research. I don't care to do it. I care to get my facts from other people and verify them as necessary, because I would prefer to spend my time doing much less productive things with my life. However, I do recognize that many of you listeners will want to know things about things that I say, and I would need to find some of those things out to make your life easy, because I'm a giver. In this case, it seems that the Peaky Blinders are named after the razor blades hidden in the brims of their flat caps that they used as weapons to slash at the face and the eyes and other vulnerable places of their enemies. This seems very morbid and quite unsportsmanlike, if you will. However, when you do a little more research, you learn that the Peaky Blinders originated around 1890 and razor blades weren't invented until 1903. Noodle on that little tidbit on your own time, Earthlings. For now, understand this. I also learned that a blinder was a name for a well-dressed man back around 1900 in that area. Whole lot less interesting and less threatening than the whole razor blade theory that makes the show fun. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. The point is, we're talking about PTSD, and some of these motherfuckers had some.
But you see that title and you're like, yeah. Well, we were starved for it. We were trying to figure out what was going on next in our Netflix lives, and I suggested we give it a shot because I heard somebody else tell me that it was good once you got into it, or one of those things that you hear. So we're watching it. It's good. It happens back in the early 1900s. So what you're dealing with is a crime family that is populated by the siblings all these brothers who were in World War I, fighting in France for England. And the stuff that they went through. Well, Tommy, the second oldest brother, is the leader of the family. Arthur, the oldest brother, is kind of the muscle. He's the guy who pulls the trigger when someone needs to be assassinated. He's the guy who he's the bodyguard that never freaking misses his opportunity to save Tommy's life or whatever else. And he's a cool guy, but he's kind of a weak-minded guy. And in the story, he struggles with PTSD from World War I. He's on cocaine to make it even. Tommy gives him that shit because at some point, because that was their best idea. Okay, back in those days when someone was struggling with something like this, the way to handle it was to take a leather glove and slap them across the face and go, get your shit together, bro. And you watch that now and you might look at that and think, Jesus, heartless, you heartless brother. How could you possibly treat your brother that way? But it's a really realistic depiction of the way it was back then with respect to this kind of thing. As a man, you were expected to handle your shit, and if you couldn't, you were slapped in the face with a leather glove. And then if that didn't work, you were given cocaine. Well, depending on what you're into, one or two of those things might sound really attractive to you. But to most people back then, I don't imagine it was the exact hug that they needed. So you're dealing with that. And then you move forward, through World War II, the Korean War, Vietnam, and then you get to all of the things that we understand about the guys who came back from Vietnam. First of all, not being received very well in America. Second of all, having been a party to a completely different kind of warfare where you really were face to face, not as much in the trenches, more like just animals in a jungle, and some of that, face blowing off on the other side of your trigger realities, really, really no shit having impacted guys in ways that they were never going to recover from. Well, it was back then in the early 70s. I don't know the exact history of PTSD, but what I do know is that sometime after Vietnam, we started to recognize that these people needed help. These soldiers needed help. And post-traumatic stress disorder, whenever it was defined, I didn't look it up. I don't look shit up. Sometimes I do. You'll see that on this podcast. I'll admit when I'm ignorant, but I do know the basics. And the basics is that post-Vietnam, we figured it out on some level. And we started to deal with the emotional and mental realities of the aftermath of war differently, and we started to try and help people. And as we've gone through the decades since that time, we've gotten better and better at it. That's a good thing, right? And now that we know what PTSD is, when a guy comes back, having, had a IED blow up his convoy, deafening sounds and horrific realities, playing over and over in your mind, and all the things, honestly, movie makers do a pretty good job nowadays recreating some of this stuff for us to understand it. And so we give these guys our sympathy, and then we give them treatment. At some point between World War I and now, PTSD became a thing, and it had a place, and it became helpful, and it became beneficial, and it was a positive thing, and it still is a positive thing to understand, not to have, to understand. Anything that becomes common knowledge, then the tendency, I think, is to not stop where it's helpful, but to get into overuse. And that's kind of what I feel like maybe is happening with PTSD, and why I think it's important to understand the middle. So the middle of the evolution of PTSD is what I'm talking about. That's where we probably needed to stop. Okay, let's call the 7-year-old who spent 2 years in isolation and is scared to go back to school and doesn't know how to interact with people, because between the ages of 6 and 8, she had none of that. And so her brain, still developing, still figuring out even who she is as a person, and not even halfway through that process, adjusted to a reality that was not going to be the case for the rest of her life. And then she was forced to be put back into the real world in a way that messed with her head. Okay, let's help her, but let's come up with a different name. So there's an example of the middle of something, the middle of an evolution, that I think is a case study for why the middle is important. Okay, you don't have to be in the middle to see the middle and recognize the middle. If you're Arthur from Peaky Blinders looking forward, and you could see PTSD looking forward, and you could see PTSD being recognized and treated, that would be a positive to you. And if you're this little girl over here and you've got a problem, and you could look backwards and you saw what that was, you'd be like, well, that's not me. This isn't him and this isn't her. This is somewhere in the middle where it belongs. That's the point of the whole thing. So that's where the idea came from. And I think that with respect to so many things in life, if we can figure that out, we can move forward. So let's talk about other middles. What about relationships? What about a marriage that's on the rocks, that's struggling? You could be in the middle, metaphorically, of a desert and not know which way you need to walk to get out of the desert. Maybe the only way to figure that out is to get out of 2 dimensions, the view that most people have most of the time, right? What about this?
Looking up.
3rd dimension, there's stars up there. There's a sun up there that tells you where east and west is, depending on what time of day. You can learn how to move in a certain direction by getting out of the 2 dimensions you're looking at and look in a 3rd dimension. Sometimes in a situation like that, what you need, because you're sitting there in the 2-dimensional world of the person that you're having so much trouble with, that was going to be everything to you, and it's not working out and you don't know where to go, sometimes a 3rd person who's not on this plane, who's on the outside looking in, can give you the same perspective. That 3rd dimension, take you out of the middle of the shit that you're in and move you into a place of learning and discovery and reconciliation and all kinds of things. Or 2 separate directions out of the middle gets you both out too. I'm not advocating that, but maybe it's the right decision in certain situations. All kinds of stuff like that. You can be in the middle of something that may be getting better. If it's bad, like the middle of chemo, and you might not know this, but a month from now you're going to be in remission. Or you could be in the middle of something good that's about to get worse. How about the ugly elephant in the room? Politics, left, right, left, middle, right. The middle is almost laughed at. nowadays. You know, the whole world used to be a whole lot closer to the middle. The Democrat and the Republican would laugh in debates with each other. There would be good-natured jibing back and forth, and then the emotions would be under control in a way that thoughts about policy could actually be considered no matter where they came from. You know, we're so far left and so far right now that we're not even facing the right direction. We're shouting to our own people, and maybe if we're shouting at the other side, we're facing the right direction, and that's a tiny, tiny step in the right direction. But what if all of that shouting could be toned down by taking steps toward that common ground? What if you were close enough to the other person with your ears open that you could hear what they had to say and they didn't have to shout, and you could let them have their turn, and then you could say what you had to say? You don't have to cross the center line. But it's one of the most challenging things that we face right now in the world with respect to all kinds of things, you know, socioeconomical stuff, politics, all kinds of things that are out there, is that we don't see compromise as even an option. And honestly, it's only partially our fault. Those of us that are kind of living our lives, doing our thing, we're listening to voices that are telling us that we can't compromise, that it's dangerous to compromise. Those people aren't your friends. They're trying to control you. I'm going to tell you that right now. Okay? Compromise is how the world moves forward. So with all the different middles that are out there, is there anything that is always true about the middle? If the middle can be good, if the middle can be bad, if it can apply to ideas and it can apply to places and it can apply to time, is there anything universal about the middle? Let me tell you what's universal about the middle, ladies and gentlemen of Earth, is that there is one. It's what I said at the beginning. Being aware of the middle is going to give you insight. It's going to give you perspective. You don't have to walk toward it. You don't have to cross from one side of it to the other. Sometimes you want to get out of it. Sometimes you want to find your way toward it. But if you understand that it exists in whatever it is that you're dealing with, if you can look for if I can find the middle in PTSD, you can find the middle of whatever it is that you're thinking about right now, whether it's physical or emotional or mental or chronological or anything else out there, you can find it. And what you do with it is completely situational. It's completely dependent on what you're talking about, what you're thinking about, what you're trying to figure out. Figure it out, understand it. It's not your enemy. If anything, it's a reference point. It's something to help you understand where you are, where other people are. Some things have no other reference point, right? If you've got nothing else, maybe even the middle itself is undefined, but you can at least maybe think about what direction that might be. That kind of stuff helps you. That kind of stuff makes you a better person. It helps you relate to other people. It helps you succeed because it helps you know how to move, how to maneuver, how to think. That's what I hope you will take from this episode, is that awareness. So yeah, there's not anything true about every middle except that it exists. That's the point, folks. I'm Matthew East. This has been Off Topic. I hope you found it more interesting than you thought you would.
Stick with me, Earthlings. We've got so much ahead of us. Listen to 5 episodes and let me demonstrate to you the diversity and the energy that we're going to bring to you coming up in the Off Topic podcast. You can also email us with your own ideas or call us. The email address is eastofftopic@gmail.com. The phone number 864-432-3379. Replay it if you need it, but call us or email us and stick with us by subscribing right now. We'll see you next time.